The Entrepreneurs. 1800s. Good God, Francis, it is no use your pretending to make cloth or any but those who have such places as me. The factory owner John Jones scoffed at a smaller rival in the early 1800s. His meaning, unless you automate your business and undertake mass production, you won't be able to compete. Despite the protests of local working people, Jones had built the largest and most mechanized cloth-making operations in the west of England. It was his gig mill operation that the croppers had fought in 1803, and his insistence that the teenaged apprentice Thomas Helliker be hanged for the mill's destruction. And it was the ardent commitment to building high-tech factories evinced by men like him that drove other business owners to adopt machinery, even when their communities, or they themselves, opposed it. For several years, the more enterprising merchants and some large master clothiers had glimpsed the riches that might accrue if they organized all stages of production under one roof, making full use of the machines that were already transforming the cotton industry, one Yorkshire historian noted. It was relatively easy on a logistical level to take the plunge into organizing production this way, essentially to develop small factories. The textile industry at the time was the land of opportunity for the energetic and ambitious man with little capital, according to one economic historian of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, it was an ideal time to launch a startup. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, many entrepreneurs who embraced new technology did so in humble, rented spaces, old grain storage rooms or empty halls, the cluttered Silicon Valley garages of the day. The equipment necessary to jumpstart an operation was not all that expensive. With a modest loan or some saved money, one could afford a few used looms, enough factory space, and even a monthly payment on a steam engine if your business required it. Though then, as now, loans were granted on the basis of many factors, including one's public standing, background, and reputation, limiting who was eligible from the outset. But as entrepreneurs invested in machinery, experimented with the division of labor, and increased their profit margins, it became clear that their gains were coming at a cost. They were sowing inequalities and resentment. They knew that working people, who were often their neighbors, opposed their actions, and had heard stories of protests, threats, and smashed equipment. There were not a lot of such audacious entrepreneurs in those days, but their ranks were growing. One particularly ambitious man named William Horsfall ran an enormous wool factory outside Huddersfield that employed 400 workers. He had rows and rows of shearing machines. His operation, per the Leeds Mercury, had attained considerable perfection. But most cloth was still manufactured by men like the clothmaker whom Jones was talking down to, and those men still owned most of the machines too. And as often as not, those men sympathized with the weavers, stockingers, and croppers when they protested that machinery would cost them their jobs. Yet many small business owners found themselves pulled toward the tech titans of their day, not toward the workers they sympathized with. Why? Imagine you run a healthy business manufacturing wool in the pre-industrial age. You buy the raw materials, or the yarn that's already been spun, and deliver it to a weaver who turns it into a rough piece of cloth. You take that cloth to be finished, all the rough parts sheared off, and the garment smoothed and softened at a cropping shop. You then take the finished cloth and sell that to your clients, or at a market. Your customers are a mix of local buyers and larger distributors to markets in farther-flung places like London or even the United States. You inherited the business and most of your contacts from your father, who was a cloth merchant like his father before him. You do not make an exorbitant amount of money, but you do well, and have close relationships with the weavers and croppers you do business with. You know their families, are friends with some of them, and are happy to pay a fair price for their work. You're satisfied with the arrangement. Obviously, it isn't perfect, and you get into arguments over the quality of a garment here or a delayed order there, but most parties feel respected, compensated, and content with the level of autonomy they enjoy in their work. It upholds tradition, and it upholds the community. But lately, business has been tough. The trade sanctions, which nearly everyone you know, from weavers to your competitors, hates bitterly, have dampened demand for your goods. There are new men getting into the business, and some of the old men have taken on a new attitude. These entrepreneurs often come from outside the community, new to their part of the trade, and don't have the same commitment to the people who live here. Instead of buying from weavers who work at home, they employ apprentices and journeymen directly in their own shops. And they have bank loans to invest in machinery that automates the process you've done with real workers for years. Most of these operations are small, but there are more and more of them. Then, some of the old masters who are a little more steely-eyed than you, along with a handful of new competitors, have invested even more grandly in new technology. They have built larger operations to gather workers under one massive roof and economize on labor. They've built factories. They know that people won't like them, but they stand to make a lot of money. Pointing to the doctrine of laissez-faire or gesturing toward progress, they announce themselves as the future. You might blame this trend on the teachings of Adam Smith. Wealth of Nations was published in 1776 and has exploded in popularity among businessmen in recent decades. Some now seem to feel that innovation, in and of itself, is a virtue. Now these competitors can sell their cloth more cheaply than you can. Some of your clients, whom you have met every week at the cloth hall for the last 10 years, have told you they must buy the less expensive option instead. Sorry, it's nothing personal. Times are tough. Your cloth business is not large enough to take many hits like this, and the writing is on the wall. Maybe the future is the gigging machine that allows a child apprentice to do multiple croppers' jobs at once, or the wide frame that can churn out cut-up stockings faster and for a fraction of the price. So you face a choice. Do you buy the machines to keep up, so you too can lower your prices, and apologize to these men and women whom you've known all your life, whom you're now helping to put out of work? Or do you stand with the cloth workers as your income ticks down? Some merchants, master clothiers, and small manufacturers did back the workers against the large entrepreneurs and refused to buy new frames. Benabilles recounts what this dilemma looked like in practice. Ben's father, the master weaver William Bamforth, is weighing whether to invest in automated machinery, as a few of his competitors are doing, and the prospect troubles him so much he visits his pastor, Mr. Webster, to seek advice. Webster quotes him a parable, saying, "It is written that the laborer is worthy of his hire, and ye may not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn." Using this machinery would stamp out the weaver's chance to earn an honest living, in other words. Webster warns Mr. Bamforth against making haste to be rich, as this new generation of businessmen seems inclined to use new tech to do. You speak of building a mill for these new methods. He continues, "And now I ask you, Brother Bamforth, can you be rich toward God if you build up your fortune on the ruin of your fellow men? You say one of these new finishing frames will do the work of 4, maybe of 6 men. Aye, also is there talk of looms that shall need neither skill nor care. It may be true, I know not. But oh, it will be a sore day for this hillside, and all the country round, when that day shall be. What is to become of those who now keep a decent roof over their heads?" "The times may be bad," he said, "but men could still earn a little bit to feed their families, their babies. You may make new machines, but you cannot make new men to order." In the story, Bamforth, who employs journeyman weavers himself, decides against automating his business. One powerful cloth merchant, the father of future conservative politician and child labor reformer Richard Ostler, also refused to invest in automation believing it to be a means of oppression on the part of the rich and of corresponding degradation and misery to the poor. Instead, he gave up the trade altogether. Others stuck with the domestic system, even when it risked driving them to bankruptcy. Many, of course, did not. Plenty were conflicted as they joined the technological race, though. They knew the social compact that workers had observed for generations was being trampled by every machine added to a shop floor. But they felt pushed toward the machines by the strongest-willed entrepreneurs, and those entrepreneurs, like Jones, Gott, and Horsfall, had no such compunctions about the workers they displaced, and were driven instead by ambition, a deeply held belief in Smith's fashionable free market philosophy, sheer greed, or a cocktail of all of the above. This was the scattershot process that set the Industrial Revolution turning. Minor, staggered investments in machinery by small manufacturers, all revolving around the examples set by large factory owners. Incidentally, it is what set later industrial revolutions turning too. As David Noble, a historian of 20th century automation, wrote, "Managers feel they must automate because everyone's doing it, out of fear that they will be undone by more up-to-date competitors, a paranoia encouraged by equipment vendors. There is this vague belief that the drive to automate is inevitable, unavoidable, and this belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy." Enough of the entrepreneurs displayed a callousness toward the working people's situation that disaffection grew throughout their ranks. "Now the masters are for making bad worse with this new machinery," a man named Soldier Jack says of the Huddersfield businessmen in Benna Bills. "They're crying, 'Every man for himself, and devil take the hindmost.'" The working people of the 1800s knew who was on which side in their community. They knew who refused the frames, who had worked to uphold tradition and to pay fair wages, and who believed it was their God-given right to buy machinery that would put their neighbors out of work in the middle of a deep recession. The Prince Regent. Summer 1811. The so-called Mad King had finally been pronounced too ill to rule. After spending long stretches of his reign battling bouts of mania, George III lapsed into a permanent state of derangement in 1811. His eldest son, George, the Prince of Wales, officially became the Prince Regent and ruler of England, though there would be restrictions on his power for a year in case the king recovered. Among the regent's first orders of business was to throw himself the most lavish party London had seen in ages. No expense was spared. The guest list sprawled past 1,500 names, including Louis XVIII, the self-proclaimed King of France, now entering his third decade in exile after the French Revolution swept away the monarchy. The highest ranks of British society and Parliament were invited, as well as the A-list celebrities of the day, writers, artists, and aristocrats. The ball was all anyone in London society talked about. It eclipsed all other news, from the war against Napoleon to the spasms of desperation from the nation's poor. On the evening of June 19, 1811, there were so many carriages bringing the British nobility to the prince's fete at Carlton House that the traffic choked the streets, and most were drawn to a complete stop. Crowds gathered to watch the guests arrive. The remarks of the people on the occupants of the carriages, as the latter crawled or jolted on at a snail's pace, were sometimes very droll and apt, though not always complimentary. George Jackson, a British diplomat, remarked, rather diplomatically. At least the aristocrats had the glory of the Carlton House itself to take in as they waited. The prince had been renovating the mansion for years, and some proclaimed it the equal of Versailles in splendor. When those guests did finally arrive, there was indeed no shortage of luxury on display. They would enter the blue velvet room, under a painted ceiling where a 3-tiered crystal chandelier glittered. Then they would move into the throne room, with its curtained Romanesque bays flanked by gilded Corinthian columns. Priceless paintings hung in the silk-draped audience rooms. Rembrandt's masterwork, A Shipbuilder and His Wife, was the prince's latest acquisition. A silver fountain fed water into an indoor canal that ran across the sprawling Gothic conservatory. The value of the diamonds, Jackson wrote, no doubt exceeded what was ever before seen in any assembly. Attendees would finally shuffle into the overstuffed ballroom, where the guests of honor, including the French exiles, the Prince Regent adored royalty and considered Louis to be the rightful monarch of France, were congregating. The prince, dressed ceremonially as a colonel, a rank he had failed to obtain in his actual military service, greeted guests with a star splayed across his chest and a saber protruding from his belt. Removed from his immediate environment, the Prince Regent cut an absurd figure against the dark mood and starved strife pervasive in 1810's England. He was self-absorbed, obese, and derided by his own constituents for his ignorance of domestic policy matters and his excessively lavish tastes. There was something puckish in his face, an air of mischief and even of innocence that went oddly with his almost indecently corpulent body. One historian wrote, "His features had always been more pretty than handsome, round and cherubic, set off by a fine head of light brown hair that had not yet begun to thin. When at his best, his grace of manner was extraordinary, though he was often not at his best, or even civil. His boyishness had its petulant side. He sulked. He was capable of malice. He could be cruel. He was an inexperienced playboy, born into immense wealth and elevated to power. The enduring image of George IV is that of Prinny, the overweight, overdressed, and oversexed buffoon waiting for his periodically deranged father to be declared unfit to rule, wrote one of his biographers. He was a spendthrift, too. By 1795, the prince had amassed an astonishing £630,000 in debt, the equivalent of nearly $76 million today. His father refused to settle the debt unless he married, so George did, and the crown picked up the tab. The grudging marriage did not stop Prinny from having countless mistresses and liaisons, and rumors of nearly as many children, or being followed by scandal during his entire tenure in power. At one point, he even tried to assign one of his known mistresses to oversee his wife's bedchamber, but was talked out of the idea, on grounds that it would be too spiteful. George III had been an attentive, even obsessive ruler. He kept meticulous notes about how ministers and parliamentarians voted and about their political opinions and positions. He was closely and fervently involved in matters of domestic policy and military operations. The king had drawn out the American War of Independence for years after it was clear England was losing, motivated by personal, aggrieved fury, and aimed to starve the opposition's will to resist. The Prince Regent had no such stomach for policy, nor military matters. He preferred to rubber-stamp the documents and legislation put in front of him by his aides. As one lord described it, he sits at a table with General Turner on one hand and Colonel McMahon on the other, the one placing a paper before him for signature and the other drawing it away. He was confirmed as regent in February of 1811. By August, he had signed thousands of documents this way. "Playing at king is no sinecure," Prince George quipped to a lord present for one rubber-stamping session. This regency period in England, from 1811 to 1820, is what historians like to describe as a time of contrasts. While farmers, artisans, and what would now be called middle-class workers were enduring levels of suffering and uncertainty they'd never experienced before, elites enjoyed unprecedented luxury. Cosmopolitan art, fashion, and architecture thrived, and a thirst for elegance and high culture was the order of the day, all embodied in, and often sponsored by, a new ruler whose tastes were unrepentantly sumptuous. Regency England captures the pop-cultural imagination like few other periods. It was the dashing aristocratic setting for Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, and, 200 years later, for the hip opulence of Netflix's Bridgerton. Night and day, it seems, the English think only of pleasure, remarked the visiting ambassador from Iran, Mirza Abul Hassan Khan, after spending some time with the Prince Regent and his court. Hence the Regent's ball, which was packed, hot, and, to onlookers, dizzyingly grandiose. Dinner was served at 2:30 in the morning. Booze flowed, and droves of servants catered to the attendees' every whim. While the upper crust declared the event a glorious success, it left a bitter taste for just about everyone left watching the proceedings outside the Carlton gates. It is said that this entertainment will cost £120,000, a young Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote in disgust, nor will it be the last bauble which the nation must buy to amuse this overgrown bantling of Regency. That amounts to almost $10 million in 2023, spent on a party at a moment when hundreds of thousands of English workers and farmers could not afford to buy bread. The lawyer, politician, and reformer Samuel Romilly, who attended the fete, later wrote, "It does not seem likely to gain the regent much popularity. The great expense of this entertainment has been contrasted with the misery of the starving weavers." It had been mere months since those weavers had revolted. Yet the riots, as well as the workers themselves, were often derided in London circles, especially among the conservative establishment. If strained trade and poor harvests had dealt them bad luck, that was unfortunate, but going around breaking productive machinery simply revealed that the workers couldn't see the bigger picture. The historian Frank Peel, mimicking the elite mood of the day, tongue very much in cheek, wrote that those weavers were too ignorant to understand that if they were miserable and starving, their masters were waging a great and glorious war. They knew only that their children were crying pitifully for bread. Had they been better instructed, they would have known that it was their duty to lie down in the nearest ditch and die. The poor would have to recognize, as the upper classes did, that this was simply part of the march of progress. Then again, it surprised few that the prince would go ahead with such a gaudy affair in troubled times. If a matter did not regard the arts, leisure, or appeal to the prince's own vanity, then it likely did not interest him much. As with most issues of domestic policy, he left them to his Tory Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, who had responded to the unrest in March by sending in British troops. A rank of precarious, angry, and impoverished workers rapidly growing across the country. New forms of technology, control, and production bringing advantages to a few at the expense of the many. A detached, vain, and despised leader at the helm. The comet had dimmed for the summer, but it was about to burn brighter than ever. George Mellor. Summer, 1811. There's hundreds of men and women and helpless babes that's just starving to death, George Mellor said to his cousin, Ben, as they walked together through the damp green fields of Huddersfield one evening, in a scene described in Ben a Bills. And now the masters are for doing the work of men and women too, with cunning contrivances that will make arms and legs of no use. They were discussing the poverty that seemed to be everywhere, that touched everyone they knew, and they were discussing automation. Water and steam in time will do the work that nature intended to be done by good, honest muscle, George said to Ben. He had good reason to predict as much. Machines that could effectively replace key parts of his trade were indeed proliferating. Between the 1790s and the 1820s, the amount of labor required to produce a piece of broadcloth would drop by 75%. What previously took 4 workers to make would just need 1. With 1 million workers employed at the peak of the trade, that meant hundreds of thousands of lost jobs. And those thrown out of work often had nowhere to turn. That's why so many in Nottingham were put to work by the city as street sweepers before the unrest in March. There was nothing else for them to do. A little saving of manual labor here and there is one thing, The displacement of human agency altogether's what you prophesy, Ben shot back. If a machine could save men a little work, it wasn't that big a deal. Despite his youth, Ben was 17. He was even taller than George, and strong with a strength that frightened me, as he described himself in Ben O'Bill's. We might imagine Ben shaking his head, waving away the visions of this steampunk robot jobs apocalypse. Calm down, George. George Meller would not. He understood that the problem lay not with the machines themselves, but with the men who owned them. "I've no patience with thee, Ben," George said. "Unless the toilers of England rise and strike for their rights, there'll soon be neither rights nor toilers. I've looked into this thing further nor you, and I can see the signs of the times. The tendencies all one way." George's worry was not that machines might become all-powerful themselves, but that those machines' owners would use them to accumulate power and wealth at his expense. There's a big difference. Ben shouldn't feel bad for conflating the two. People still do this 200 years later. George recognized that those who deploy automation can use it to erode the leverage and earning power of others, to capture for themselves the former earnings of a worker. For decades, their trade had been governed by the notion of fair profits, a compact about what was morally reasonable for a merchant or businessman to earn by selling a worker's wares. The entrepreneurs and factory owners were now using machinery and laissez-faire philosophy to unspool that compact. Now George feared that this tendency that's all one way would result in a small number of people, our first tech titans, accumulating a large amount of wealth, forcing workers to submit to their terms and conditions. And he felt that no one in power, not the state, nor the magistrates, nor the businessmen, was looking out for the workers, or the poor. "What I've seen has burned into my soul," George said. "The natural rights of man are not thought of in this country. The unnatural rights of property have swallowed them up. It's all property, property." It makes sense that George would link laments of rising automation with lost property rights, too. He had grown up in the era of enclosure, with the national government enforcing a major transfer of the public commons, land once used by whole communities for sheep grazing, farming, and recreation, into land possessed and controlled by a much smaller group of owners, the landed gentry. Enclosure hit George's town 4 years before he was born. He would have seen stone walls being erected between homes and around pastures for the first time, the nebulous concept of private property stumbling into being. It would have helped convince George that the spree of mechanization was funneling its gains into an economy increasingly marked by rising privatization and inequality that excluded more and more men like himself and his peers. For 2 centuries, there had been a steady concentration of economic power in the hands of a small class. J.L. Hammond and Barbara Hammond wrote in The Skilled Laborer, 1760 to 1832. The historians trace the growth of this power through the appropriation of the monastic lands, the decay and disappearance of the guilds, the enclosures, the changes in school and university, the rise in one trade after another of capitalism in a form that enables the few to control the productive energy of the many. In the medieval village all over Europe, here as elsewhere, the medieval man had certain rights. On the dissolution of that old village society in England, those rights were lost. This inequality expressed itself in yet another way. In 18th century England, communities lived under the constant threat of a virus. Records show that in the 1700s, up to 10% of all burials were the result of smallpox. Smallpox was probably the single most lethal disease in 18th century Britain, according to historical demographers. A vaccine was discovered in 1796, when George Meller was still a boy, but inequality and the deadly disease combined to begin a pernicious trend. The late 18th century witnessed the emergence of class differences in mortality, where rich urban residents had significantly higher survival chances than their rural and poorer peers. For a young person, the future must have looked bleak, ruined by ambiguous authoritarian forces, power that was driving the foundations under George's feet to shift. These new forces were stamping out centuries of tradition to rearrange who controlled what, like the factory masters adopting machinery to erode standards and cut into the croppers' business. "The French have more sense than us," George said. "They saw the threat and toppled the ruling class in their revolution." His statement flirted with treason, even if it was not an uncommon opinion. Another Yorkshire resident echoed that sentiment, stating that, given how fed up people were with bribery, corruption, luxury, tyranny, oppression, and poverty, if Napoleon had invaded England, they would have joined Bonaparte, for they were so much oppressed, they were ready to proceed to any act of violence and desperation, for none could get bread enough, and many died for want of it. "The French," George said, "saw all the good things of this life were grasped by the nobles and the priests. They saw that the people made wealth by their toil, and the seigneurs, that's lords, and the church enjoyed the wealth they made, only leaving them bare enough to keep body and soul together. They sent their proud lords and ladies packing." Moral outrages are most acute when they are personal, and George's was certainly personal. The breakneck evolutions of his time, the relentlessly accelerating technologies, the harsh politics of inequality, the privatization, and the pandemic. He was in the process of suffering the injustice of seeing his working identity stripped from him. 7 years of training pronounced worthless. "There's a conspiracy on foot to improve and improve," he said, "till the working man that has nothing but his hands and his craft to feed him and his children will be improved off the face of creation." The machinery question. 1800s. The notion that textile workers like Ben Bamforth and George Miller would discuss the prospect of losing their agency to machines in the early 1800s, when the machinery in question was a wooden, water-powered loom, may strike us as implausible. Our 21st century visions of displacement by machines, after all, concern omniscient artificial intelligences and sleek autonomous robotics. But George and Ben's argument was colored by deeper anxieties, too. What is the value of human labor, they wondered, or even human life, in a world where technologies seem constantly poised to replace us? In fact, it's remarkably similar to debates we're still having 200 years later, in books like Rise of the Robots, film franchises like Terminator, and cable news segments about the looming AI takeover. Our fascination with the idea that the machines we build will one day do our jobs for us, become as intelligent as us, or even replace us entirely and move among us as humans, dates to some of our earliest popular culture. Jewish folklore of the golem, an anthropomorphic mass of mud or clay brought to life by divine magic, predates the Bible. AI is older than Jesus, and the first widely known story of job-replacing machinery is even older. The word automaton first appears in Western literature in Homer's Iliad, where it's used to describe the self-moving and intelligent machines fabricated by Hephaestus, the blacksmith god of technology, according to the Stanford folklorist and historian of ancient science Adrian Mayer. Around 700 BCE, Homer wrote about Hephaestus's various automated inventions, which included a fleet of driverless, three-wheeled carts that delivered nectar and ambrosia to the gods' banquets, automatic gates, bellows that self-adjusted their trumpet blasts as needed, and a crew of artificially intelligent golden female androids that could anticipate the blacksmith god's every need. And the Greeks were drawing on even older oral traditions. That means that more than 2,700 years ago, people were able to imagine automatons and self-moving devices long before technological inventions made them feasible, Mayer explained. These imagined innovations were forged in service of accomplishing wondrous stuff. Greek myths about automation, as well as the semi-automated devices they actually tried to build, presented a hopeful, rather than ominous, vision for the future of machinery, as the AI historian Kanta Dehal notes. They signal an understanding of the power that lay in automation's potential. If a machine could assist the gods, it would be extremely powerful indeed. Powerful enough to end the need for slavery, the philosophers argued. In one of the most odious segments of his Politics, Aristotle lays out his defense of natural slavery, that some men are simply better suited to be servile, essentially, and muses that enslaved persons would not be necessary if only the labor they carry out could be automated. If every instrument could accomplish its own work, obeying or anticipating the will of others, like the statues of Daedalus or the tripods of Hephaestus, he wrote, and if in like manner the shuttle would weave and the plectrum touch the lyre without a hand to guide them, chief workmen would not want servants, nor masters slaves. Or automation might abolish slavery. Aristotle owned slaves himself, and this helped enshrine the idea that a certain class of people are interchangeable with machines, an attitude that would undergird the actions of elites in coming millennia. The philosopher also helped inaugurate the tradition of insisting that exploiting the human laborer is a necessary evil on the path to full automation, which is always just around the bend. Notably, by the time Ben and George were having their debate, the weaving shuttle had already been automated via a device called the Flying Shuttle, and yet there were plenty of servants and poor workers still to be found in England. Still, for nearly a millennium, before there were many meaningful real-world examples to draw on, dreams of automation presented in prose and poetry were optimistic. The concept was admired by elites, who may prefer not to own slaves or pay servants, and perhaps even by workers, who would prefer not to be either. These dreams were a source of hope and excitement, until the Industrial Revolution. In the Middle Ages, humans began to widely fear automated machines as a force that could run dangerously amok, and it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, when automation began to intrude on the livelihoods of the middle, educated, and even upper classes, the classes that tend to produce culture, that automation was seen as a threat to our humanity. At the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, the factories that sent foreboding plumes of smoke and pollution into the skies offended the sensibilities of some of the aristocrats and all of the poets, and a discomfort with mechanization spread. Machinery and mass production drove the rise of the factory city and the industrialization of the countryside. They were aesthetically unpleasant and endangered human health. They were the heart of the dark satanic mills, as the Romantic poet William Blake famously put it, converting pastoral idyls into polluted, mechanized blight. They were the engines that drove the exploitation of working people, of children. But would they bring progress, too? Would the mass adoption of technology be worth it? This was articulated as the so-called machinery question, reductively, the "are robots coming for our jobs" of the Industrial Revolution. The ultimate, the most exciting, and the most threatening development of all, historian Maxine Berg wrote, was the replacement of man by machine. It towered over all other inquiries about the impacts of technology. And in the 1800s, it really was an open question. It was not obvious which path history would take, or what the outcomes of adopting mass automation would be. The moral possibility of reversing the entire tendency, as George Miller called it, was very real. It was far from clear whether it was a portent of inevitable economic revolution, or but one course of development among several, which might be adopted or rejected, Berg wrote. Would the machine bring wealth only to those who owned it, or to society as a whole? Would it make work or create unemployment? Would it unite society or foment class conflict? One's answer to the machinery question was often split, as it is today, along class lines. The middle class, the romantics, and small landowners tended to oppose the new technology, while entrepreneurs and elites embraced it. And for the workers directly affected, then as now, the answer was clearer cut. It would not be helpful to them if machinery was used to degrade or take their jobs. The writer and critic Thomas Carlyle speculated that, should the workmen lose their faith in God, presumably a last remaining comfort against the crushing factory system, a blind no-God of necessity and mechanism that held them like a hideous world steam engine, then the outcome seemed clear. Their only resource, he wrote, would be, with or without hope, revolt. Ned Ludd.